Hello, Western Civ 105. I am going to make this announcement to make some clarifications on a point that I think is just really important. Look, I'm having you already watch or listen to a podcast on the question of whether or not Hitler was a leftist socialist, and the argument is no. And I already noticed that some of you are not. I mean, I mentioned that you don't have to listen to the whole podcast, but the podcast starts with arguments being made by a person that are going to be debunked, and you are listing the debunked information. Okay? So you're not putting any thought or effort into this when you do that. You need to actually at least listen enough to understand the debate that's taking place. Okay? And the reason why I'm having this be a priority is because we're really at a time where it's a false information age in many ways. I mean, the whole topic of fake news. Um, it's just bad. I want good history. I'm not making. I'm not having you listen to this podcast to focus on discrediting the popular vloggers that are being discredited in this podcast. I'm not actually making a defense for leftism or socialism or a critique of it. I'm merely trying to make the case, the argument very clear to you, that Hitler was not a socialist leftist. And there's reason. But there's also a good reason to be confused, because Nazis were called National Socialists. Fair enough. So what I just wanted to do is talk about Mussolini and Hitler compared and contrasts to the Soviet Union or Marxism and to communism and socialism. And I'll try to make this really brief and not too complicated. So first of all, this is what we need to understand. During this time period, capitalist democracy was heavily called into question. It's kind of like right now in American politics, right? The reason why Trump and Bernie Sanders and people like Bernie Sanders have been popular for many parts of America, it's because they're not satisfied with the way that things have been going. And so if you look at Trump now, and you look at political figures like Bernie Sanders and Alejandro Ocasio-Cortez, would you say that they're the same? They're not the same. They're opposed to each other. Where they are similar is that they are really a byproduct of the times of critiquing the system from two different angles. They represent a part of the population that's not happy with business as usual, things the way that they are. Okay? That's where they're similar. But during this time period, it gets a little bit more murky that we're talking about in the inner war years between World War I and World War II. So let me focus on that with you. Mussolini was a socialist originally, and he came out of it, and he really ends up being an ultra nationalist. Fascism is a particular ideology created by Mussolini, which is about the entire nation being unified. And the state is to be strong. And you want a strong leader with a strong state. They criticize capitalism because capitalism in of itself, by itself, is driven by profit motive. And it doesn't care about the nation. See, capitalism doesn't have a value system outside of profit motive. So this is where the fascists and the socialists and the communists are going to start sounding alike, because they're going to criticize capitalism. They're both going to take a criticism of capitalism. But for the fascists, the problem with capitalism is it just needs to be reined in and know where it belongs. And the state has the last word. So you're going to allow wealthy business interests into the country, but they can't do anything that conflicts with the interests of the state. You see? It's, like when we say America first. Well, this is on steroids, right? Italy first, meaning, okay, make all the business you want, but if you think that you're going to, let's say, use immigrants from another country when we're trying to preserve the racial harmony of the state or the ethnicity of the state, which is what a lot of these right-wing guys were doing, because this comes from the politics of the right, then they're not going to allow that, or hypothetically. So also, rich and poor people are not to have a conflict with the rich people. Nobody is supposed to be in conflict. You are to be harmoniously together, united as a state. For the socialists and the communists, the problem that they see is capitalism itself. Capitalism isn't something that just needs to be harnessed. I mean, there'll be some socialists like that, but the communists in particular wanted capitalism abolished. They saw that as a problem, and they viewed class conflict as the root of the problem, in which the ruling class needed to be put in their place, ousted. There's combat with them. So for the fascists, communists are troublemakers for the harmony of the state. Do you understand? Fascism comes from the right. It's a form of ultranationalism. And sometimes people now, because, the problem that people get confused is that there's many normal, sober-minded people that simply say, I'm a nationalist. And they say, I think that America should be first. And then people say, you're a fascist. Well, that does fit into the category of fascism, but does that make you a fascist? And I would say no. But the reality is that fascism, that is the core of fascism that then gets put, like as I said, on steroids. It gets amped up into some really a very chauvinistic, a very violent, and a very authoritarian way. Okay? And Hitler's going to embrace the same ideas. Hitler is going to see the German nation as the ultimate goal for unity, but with him as the powerful leader. Socialism was popular at the time of Hitler. He was also working with right-wing groups that had more socialist leanings, and you see in the podcast that he eventually ends up knocking them out of the way. If you look at the history of the Nazis and Hitler, as the podcast that I'm having you follow, he's not a socialist. I mean, he doesn't look at class conflict, he sees racial conflict. And he sees Jews as the major threat to that. And he accuses Jews as being basically synonymous with communism. And so, if you read Mein Kampf, if you look at Hitler's book, he rages against the socialists and communists as basically all being a Jewish plot and conspiracy. And that's why nobody in Europe that had to deal with the Nazi occupation or fought the Nazis thinks this is even an argument to talk about Hitler coming from the left perspective. Now look, Stalin comes from the left perspective. It's a different argument entirely to say that the left doesn't have the capability of doing things that are as bad as the right. And when you talk about having dictatorships and a strong state and authoritarianism and big prison systems and secret police, if you think that this is just something that communists or the Soviet Union had, that's authoritarian states. And if you look around the world now, there are many there's always been violent, oppressive, totalitarian like states that are anti-communist and anti-socialist. And you have vice versa. Look, in the United States, when you say you're a conservative, you usually, if you're a traditional American conservative, you want a decentralized government. You don't want a strong state. If you are traditional conservative in Russia, then having a Putin is being a conservative. having a strong man rule America would not be a traditionally conservative perspective from the American tradition. So Mussolini and the Nazis do not fit into the American conservative perspective, and they don't fit into the American left-wing socialist perspective if we just looked at America. And that's why, even the modern neo-Nazi movement, they themselves came up with the term alt-right. I'm sure you've heard that. Alt-right is short for alternative right. And if you researched what those guys are saying, they're actually very anti-conservative because they want a strong state and they're not beholden to the idea of the Constitution and or any of that. Okay, they're more or less embracing the traditions that go back to Mussolini and Hitler, even if they're not fully embracing all of those the ideas of those characters. And so it's as simple as that. So when I see these so many commentators now that are conservative commentators talking about leftist fascists or talking about Antifa and other groups as the alt-left, well, that's a whole nother topic. It's just, we don't need to distort history to make a critique of something that we have an issue with now, okay? So a lot of the left sometimes just labels conservatives fascists very loosely, and that's also a big problem. And so, yeah, I want to end on that note saying as well is that, when we're going to use terms like socialists and fascists and communists, there are people who still embrace those ideas. Those ideas and ideologies have their own legacies in the world. They have people who critique them and defend them. But you also have a lot of people just throwing these labels around and they're putting them into categories and labeling people this improperly. So I hope that that's clear enough. Please feel free to question me with communicate with me if you want clarity on any of this, and have a great week.